Welcome to the Church of Perpetual Life and our first live stream only service. My name is Neil Vandry and I am your officiator. If this is your first time joining us here on the live stream, I'd like to invite you to join our email list so that we can keep you updated on all that is going on with Radical Life Extension so you may live a longer and healthier life. I understand that there are many people around the world who are creating watch parties, and we welcome you, and we would like to invite you to do the same in your cities. So often I am contacted by people asking if we have a Church of Perpetual Life in their city. We are the only one in the world, and we live stream all of our services, so you can watch all of our past services on your YouTube channel. You can also have live meetups when we have our services, or feel free to use any of our past recordings and share them with all of the people that you love. I miss you all, and I bet that you miss coming here to our service. Please let me know how you are doing. Communicate with me by text or by email. And please let me know if anyone from our church is suffering with COVID-19 or any other health challenge. I'd also love for you to share any joyful news that you have as well. Here at the Church of Perpetual Life, we refer to ourselves as Immortalists, not because we have defeated death, but because we have faith that future technology will conquer disease and aging, as well as death itself. While we fully understand that this technology is not currently available, the impressive history of human problem solving and technological advancement gives us faith in this inevitability. Please join with me now in our creed, the Creed of Perpetual Life. We believe that all life is sacred and that we have been given this one life to make unlimited. We believe in our Creator's divine plan for all of humanity to have infinite lifespans in perfect health and eternal joy, rendering death to be optional. By following our gospel, we achieve eternal life, creating a heaven here on earth. We follow Nikolai Fedorov, who taught that the transcendence of the Creator will only be solved when humanity, in our unified efforts, become an instrument of universal resuscitation, when the divine word becomes our divine action. And we follow Arthur C. Clarke, who said, "The only way to discover the limits of the possible is to go beyond them into the impossible." And so we enter each day energized in spirit and empowered with the words of our prophets to live in joy, serving the Creator and all of mankind forever and ever. Our mission here at Perpetual Life is to assist all people in the radical extension of healthy human life. We provide fellowship for longevity enthusiasts at our regular services. We have guest speakers that teach scientific rationality along with the Creator's plan that humanity evolved to achieve markedly extended healthy human lifespans. We follow the prophet Arthur C. Clarke, who said, every revolutionary idea seems to evoke 3 stages of reaction. They may be summed up in the phrases, number 1, it's completely impossible. Number 2, it's possible, but it's not worth doing. And number 3, I said it was a good idea all along. Here at Perpetual Life, we say that living an indefinite lifespan is a great idea, and we have been saying that all along. We follow Prophet Nikolai Fedorov's philosophy of the common task for humanity. Fedorov believed, as we do here, that we should divert human energies away from wars and ascension and toward measures for protecting mankind against natural disasters, such as this current COVID-19 epidemic, floods, droughts, hurricanes, and especially aging, and to transform nature from a temporary enemy into an eternal friend. We are working to defeat death itself. And we are excited to let you know that we now have a PayPal account for donations to the church. You will find a link on our website at perpetual.life. I have been asked by some members how they can add the Church of Perpetual Life to their will. If this is something that you would like to do, please contact me and I'll help you to arrange this. If you prefer to send a check as a donation, you can make your check out to the Church of Perpetual Life and mail it to our address, also found at our website. And you can reach me for anything online. Reach me by email at stopoldage@aol.com, or just send an email right through the church website. Tonight we are thrilled to have a presentation by Dr. Michael Rose. Dr. Rose is a professor at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California, Irvine. His main area of work has been the evolution of aging. He has studied both the evolution of mortality late in life and now especially the evolution of fecundity late in life. He has developed evolutionary theories for late life plateaus, sometimes called immortality, and tested them using fruit flies. Reverse evolution and laboratory adaptation have been major topics in experimental evolution that he has pursued. Dr. Rose is a prominent author of many books and articles in many journals. He is on the Scientific Advisory Council of Transvio Technology Ventures and was awarded the Busse Research Prize by the World Congress of Gerontology. He was also awarded the President's Prize by the American Society of Naturalists. Let's welcome Dr. Rose.
Hi there. I see I'm live. Okay. I would like to be able to see my slides at some point. Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Neil. I feel that your audience is one of the handful of audiences that is willing to listen to what I have to say about biological immortality and how I believe as a scientist that it's a real thing and that the significance of the reality of biological immortality is very profound for our approach to aging, not only from the standpoint of understanding, but also from the standpoint of intervening in aging as a problem that humanity faces. I first started to realize that biological immortality was a thing way back in the 1970s when I first started studying aging as a graduate student in England. And my interest in immortality has grown ever since. And while at first that was sort of a minor aspect of my research on aging, now I really feel in some ways that the importance of the evolution of immortality is really key to understanding aging and what, in a sense, the significance of aging is for us. So I'm going to get started now by going through my slide deck. And if there are any technical glitches, I'm going to hope that it'll be pointed out to me by someone. So second slide, please. All right. So one of the most poignant ways to understand the significance of aging for all of us is if you think about the difference between aging as we have done it, at least up until December 2019, with a life expectancy of 80 years, versus what our lifespans would be like if, in fact, we did not age at all in a demographic sense. That is to say, what if we all had the same capacity to survive and function as healthy humans that we, in fact, had around the age of 12, 13, or 14, when demographically our survival rates bottom out? And if you do that calculation, there are different ways to do it, but if you do it, you end up with a life expectancy of anywhere from 1,200 to 2,000 or more years. So just think about 2,000 years versus 80 years. Now you might wonder what's going on that you don't go on living past 2,000 years or 3,000 years. And of course, the short answer there is accidents and infectious disease, where in accidents we also have events, regrettable events like homicide and suicide. So if we were to banish aging, we would live, I think, far longer than people intuitively realize. So aging, as we humans do it now, steals not dozens of years, but in fact, hundreds of years from our lives. So now I'd like my next slide, please. Now, while in the 1980s and early 1990s, I was pretty much alone in advocating a radical attack on aging as a solvable scientific problem. Starting in the mid-90s, and of course accelerating much more in the 2000s, more and more people have accepted the idea of radically intervening in aging. Unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, their approach to how we should intervene in aging is based on the idea that aging is a form of cellular molecular rust. The people who propound that idea probably don't know that this idea originated with Aristotle, and it's been a consensus viewpoint for thousands of years among biologists. For thousands of years, biologists have believed that aging is a process of physiological deterioration due to some combination of breakdown or disharmony. One of the people who made it closest to biochemical rust was the late Denham Harman in his free radical theory of aging. But all of the elaborations of cell and molecular mechanisms of aging that are widespread, that are advocated by figures such as Aubrey de Grey, are variations on the idea of aging as a progressive breakdown or damage process. So one of my goals as a scientist has been to effectively test this idea, which is so widely held among most kinds of biologists and indeed lay people, that it is regarded as a fact. Is it a fact that aging is rust? Next slide, please. Well, right away, this brings us to the scientific fact and scientific challenge of the existence of biologically immortal organisms. And there are many different kinds of them. Here I'm showing you a picture of a creosote bush that has been dated as having lived at least 10,000 years. It still lives and grows in the Mojave Desert of California. You drive through the Mojave Desert when you drive from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, which of course many of us did up until April 2020. What you're looking at in this sort of loop-like structure is a bush that shares a common root system. And it started life as a very small bush, and very slowly it has grown outward to create that kind of structure. What a lot of people don't realize is how common this is among animals, plants, and certainly microbes that they may have seen many times or heard discussed many times. So for example, sea anemones, the ones that reproduce by splitting in two, also have this attribute of biological immortality, and many of you may have seen sea anemones when you explore the intertidal zone or do scuba diving just off coastlines. More common organisms are some types of ornamental juniper, shrub. The tree aspen, some species of aspen grow much like these creosote bushes, and can stand there for tens of thousands of years. So biological immortality, animals and plants that can go on living and living and living without dying unless there's an accident or an infection or some other type of disaster, actually have been known and studied by biologists for decades. One of my favorite examples is the simple lab hydra, a coelenterate. If you give it good conditions, people like Danielle Martinez have kept them alive without any single individual dying decade after decade. This is a tiny little invertebrate animal. So apparently, despite the near universal belief in the inevitability of biochemical damage and thus aging, quite a few species have evolved that don't seem to believe in that theory whatsoever. Quite a few species of animals, plants, and microbes have evolved without dying of an internal process of damage at the molecular or cellular levels. And this includes animals that have differentiated cells and different types of tissues like us. So in other words, to the extent to which aging is, of course, a problem, as it is for us subjectively, it's a problem that for other species, evolution has been able to solve very easily. So that raises the question, well, how did it do that? And if I go to my next slide, please, I'll explain why evolution will sometimes completely solve the aging problem, whatever the underlying biological machinery. So could I have my next slide, please? Thank you. If you have an organism that reproduces by splitting in two, evolutionary biologists call it fissile. If that fissile reproduction is strictly symmetrical, so that the products of that division process of reproduction are the same as each other with respect to any physiological disruption. If aging were to occur physiologically in that type of organism and accumulate over time, then the species would die out. So all fissile species that remain are species that have solved the problem of aging. Evolution by natural selection gave them no choice. One way evolutionary biologists describe this situation is to say that in such species, the force of natural selection has stayed strong. Next slide, please. So aging is a product of evolution, and it's a contingent product of evolution. So what is the contingency? What circumstances lead to evolution letting us age? The basic idea that essentially all evolutionary biologists who thought deeply about the problem agree on was first proposed in 1941 by J.B.S. Haldane, one of my academic grandparents. He suggested that Huntington's disease was common as a genetic disease because natural selection is weak at later ages. So let me talk a little bit about what Huntington's disease is. If you're a fan of folk song, then you've probably heard of Woody Guthrie. You may have sung one of his songs in elementary school. I know I did. Next slide, please. So Woody Guthrie was killed by Huntington's disease. And in this slide, I've shown you a picture of what happens to the brain of a victim of Huntington's disease by the time they die. Well before that point in their lives, they start to experience, let us say the victims of Huntington's disease, start to experience problems with coordination, Their IQ starts to fall off. As the disease proceeds, their personality starts to change. They often become aggressive, irritable, and effectively they're going through a pervasive dementia. Their brain is rotting out, as you can see from this picture. And we now know the molecular genetics of this syndrome definitively. It's due to having a single bad copy of a gene that is named after the disease, the gene Huntington. And the important feature of this disease, which obviously is terrifying, is that it is extremely common, even though everybody who gets just a single copy of the disease-causing gene will later go on to suffer and die from that gene if they don't die of some other cause earlier. The important thing about the demography of this genetic disease is that it rarely has effects before the age of 30. And the devastating effects are characteristically experienced in the 40s and 50s. So very often, as in the case of Woody Guthrie, the individual victim of this disease may have already had children. In fact, those children might even be over 10 years old before this disease starts to really devastate the life of the afflicted victim. So Haldane argued way back when that natural selection, to speak in anthropomorphic terms, stopped caring as you get to your later ages, because in effect you didn't have much future reproductively. Next slide, please. Now, here I'm showing you a picture of a victim of childhood progeria. This is a child between the ages of about 10 and 13. This child looks like a tiny little old man, balding, mostly toothless, wrinkled. Their hearts are often afflicted with quite severe cardiac disease. The children afflicted by this disease generally are killed by it before the age of 20. This disease also is due to a single bad gene, a genetic variant at the lamin A locus. But the important contrast here is that this is a very rare disease across all human populations. And we can be quite sure of that because this is one of the easiest of all genetic diseases to correctly diagnose. Most physicians would be able to diagnose this genetic disease seeing a patient at a distance of some tens of yards because they're so distinctive. So the contrast that Haldane and successor evolutionary biologists are interested in is that Huntington's disease is very common with tens of thousands of victims around the world. This genetic disease, similarly fatal, similarly due just to one copy, the deadly disease, is extremely rare. The difference is that progeria kills children before they get a chance to reproduce. Huntington's disease kills its victims after they have had a chance to reproduce. So that's why Haldane drew attention to future reproduction as the key to the force of natural selection. I have my next slide, please. In 1966, a man called William Hamilton, now deceased, calculated what the force of natural selection acting on such devastating genetic diseases would be as a function of age. And there are basically three phases for the force of natural selection. The first phase is between 0 and that blue line, at the bottom of which is the little letter B. And that blue line marks the start of reproduction in an entire population, not just when a particular individual starts reproducing. For that period, which will include all the childhoods of every individual in that population, though not necessarily all of those individual childhoods, In that period, the force of natural selection has been shown mathematically to be at 100%. What that means is that any genetic disease that kills in this 100% zone during everybody's childhood, that disease is radically selected against. It is a genetic disease. It stays at very low levels in any population because the force of natural selection wipes out that genetic disease every time it arises. Now, I want you to look all the way to the right of that figure at the shallow purple triangle that starts at a lowercase d, or the last age of reproduction in a population, little d. At every age after that last age of reproduction, natural selection, its force, is at 0. What that means is that at every age after that point in time, natural selection is serenely indifferent to the fate of those individuals, to how well they function, how well they can survive. That's the zone, which I sometimes call the Scarlet O'Hara zone, after Rhett Butler has got totally fed up with her by the end of Gone with the Wind, and Rhett Butler doesn't give a damn anymore, and that's where natural selection doesn't give a damn anymore. Now, in between those ages of little b and little d, Hamilton showed that the force of natural selection steadily declines with age. Those are the ages of adulthood in every species that has a child and an adult, and adults that reproduce by means of eggs or seeds. In all of these populations, every single one of them, all of which lack clonal reproduction, the force of natural selection falls with adult age until little d. Now, that of course sounds pretty abstract, so we go to my next slide. I have a simple animation that tries to explain this. So in early life, lethal genes are not passed on. Natural selection stops them. But after little d, in late life, lethal genes are readily passed on. What that means is natural selection is working very, very powerfully to make children amazingly good at survival and getting ready for reproduction. And then once the reproductive phase is over, as far as natural selection is concerned, it's done with you. And in all the ages in between, natural selection is progressively and quantitatively fading out. Some people misunderstand this, and they think that what this is showing is that aging only happens after you finish reproduction. That's a common verbal formulation of this theory, which is incorrect. Next slide, please. So in my animation, in a sense, I'm representing that common idea, but I'm neglecting what happens in the orange box. Inside the orange box is when the forces of natural selection fall, so that you go from a state of 100% natural selection to 0% natural selection. That is what we commonly call the evolutionary theory of aging. Now, you'll notice I haven't said anything about telomeres, free radical damage, or anything of the kind. That's because this core principle of the evolution of aging due to the declining force of natural selection is completely general across all physiological mechanisms of deterioration. Any situation, any physiological process, or any aspect of physiology or indeed anatomy which can help survival will be strongly favored by evolution at early ages and not strongly favored by evolution at very late ages, with that quantitative drop-off in between. Now, if I've got you sort of following along to this point, I can have my next slide. I'm going to show you an idea that I had in the 1970s, where I realized if I shift the reproductive window, then evolution by natural selection will clean up deleterious mutations that hit early before reproduction in this new reproductive scenario where reproduction is delayed, which should by itself lead to a longer and more robust lifespan. And at that time, I was working in a lab in England, working with fruit flies. If I could have my next slide, please. And I realized the way we normally reproduce fruit flies is shown on the left. It's called selection regime B. And selection regime B is the typical 2-week life cycle that we give standard labbed fruit flies in the incubators and lab spaces that we maintain at temperatures over about 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 to 25 degrees Celsius. And those kinds of regimes, the fruit fly develops from an egg, as shown in the bottom, becomes a larva, as shown on the left, then a pupa, and then it emerges as an adult after 10 or 11 days. The adults have big frat parties where fertilization occurs, and they're ready to lay eggs the ripe old age of 14 days. At that point, which not accidentally is 2 weeks' time, the lab technician or graduate student, as in my case, lets the flies lay eggs in new culture vials or bottles and discards the adults and starts a new generation. We do that because we always need new fruit flies to do genetic experiments with. But in the late 1970s, I realized, well, you know, since when the organism reproduces is supposed to be the key to evolution by natural selection, all I have to do to find out what it's like to evolve increased lifespan is to make lab evolution of my fruit flies, evolve it for me, and all I had to do was to delay the age at which I collected eggs from my cultures of fruit flies, and that's shown on the right under the heading Selection Regime O. And this story has been covered many times by journalists. They tend to call Selection Regime O the career woman reproductive pattern. I think that's an error. I think anybody who is going to undergo severe regimes of training and qualification for a career, be that physician, professor, sometimes even lawyer, they're well advised to delay reproduction, whether they're male or female. So I tend to call Selection Regime O the graduate student or professional student reproductive pattern, where, of course, you don't start reproducing while you're in the middle of your doctoral degree. You wait until you finish the doctoral degree, and then usually you wait while you're a postdoctoral fellow, or in case of law, you're articling, and then you wait still longer until you get some type of job security, like tenure, and only then, in your late 30s to late 40s, are you finally willing to risk the encumbrances of reproducing, and then you do it. Now, the difference between doing this experiment with humans and doing this experiment with fruit flies is that I could do this experiment on a scale of 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. I could start off by delaying when I let the adult flies lay eggs for a period of 2 to 4 weeks after 14 days, and do that generation after generation. And lo and behold, by the end of the 1970s, I'd already shown that this would lead to the evolution of increased lifespan. And we've been doing this experiment over and over again. And just to remind you, next slide, please. Here is what happened. Evolution by natural selection cleaned out genes that were having early deleterious effects, and naturally, across the entire genome and the entire physiology of the fly, producing an organism that had longer and more robust lifespans. And this happens right in front of our eyes over the course of just a few years. Now you might wonder, well, what does survival look like after you've done an experiment of that kind? And I'll show you in the next slide, please. Here you have experimental data after about 12 to 15 years, where the bred normally lines for both males and females show the normal pattern of death as a function of adult age in flies kept under excellent conditions, and the bred under delayed reproduction condition after dozens of generations, in this case 80 generations of delayed breeding, those organisms are living about twice as long. And I'm not showing you this here, but they live twice as long with lots of reproductive capacity. They actually reproduce more in total across their lifespan. They're very good athletically. They resist stress better. In a sense, these are superflies. They've been called Methuselah flies often in the journalistic literature about them, which has been around for about 40 years. In my lab, we just call them O flies for reproduction from older females. So up to this point, what I've shown is not really scientifically controversial. It's been well established in the scientific literature over the last 40 years since I first published it in the journal Nature and published experiments like this. Many other journals discussed in books. Many other people have done experiments like this. It's standard part of the biological literature. And this was my main interest for the first 20 years of my career. And then in the mid-90s, I got diverted by the problem shown in the next slide, please, which is the problem of why do some people live so long? If our death rates increased as a function of our adult ages as unrelentingly after the age of 90 as they do between the ages of 20 and 90, there'd be practically no chance of anybody living to 110, much less the 122 years achieved by Madame Jeanne Calment, shown here in the black and white photograph. One thing I didn't know when I first started thinking about this problem was that very good data explaining why she could live this long have been published decades earlier from human populations. Next slide, please. This is a picture regraphed from data published in 1939 showing the mortality rates of English women during the early 1900s. And the amazing thing about their mortality rates between the ages of 93 and 103 is they're not increasing. They're fluctuating a fair amount, but there's really not the dramatic increase in death rates that is in fact seen in every human population that's given good conditions in the 20s and 80s years of age. So this is a problem I started to think about in the 1990s. And what I realized is that some of the basic ideas I've already shown you can explain this pattern. Next slide, please. One of the things that stopped people from taking these human data seriously for a period of more than 60 years is that the phenomenon had not been observed in lab animals until the 1990s. And here I'm showing you lab data from the 1990s. The data on the left are from my lab. The data on the right are from a giant study led by Jim Carey of UC Davis. And these data, too, are now widespread. In these data, you see on a log scale, this linear rise in mortality on a log scale, which corresponds to an exponential rise on a linear scale. And then, regardless of the scale you use, eventually you end up with flat and relatively stable mortality rates later in life, in a period which a lot of us now call late life, and some of us, like myself, like to call late life biological immortality. Basically, what these data are showing next slide please, is a pattern also found in the human data, which is in childhood you have a low and fluctuating mortality pattern. Childhood biologists call it development. Then in the aging phase, in all the species that age, and remember, not all do age, but in all aging species, you get this increased mortality, usually exponentially increased. And then finally, if you give very large cohorts very good conditions, you see what I've called here the immortal phase, during which mortality stabilizes, or as I sometimes say, aging stops. Now, if you've been paying attention this far, you realize on the one hand, earlier I was saying, well, evolution says that in all animals that reproduce with eggs or seeds, you get this aging phase. Why does evolution then allow aging to stop? Well, basically, let's go back to the idea of the force of natural selection, the slide I already shown you. And the force of natural selection is kind of the inverse of the mortality rate. When it's very high, the mortality rate is very low. And when it falls, we expect the mortality rate to rise. So let's invert this diagram. Next slide, please. And look at, next slide, please. And look at the weakness of natural selection. And if you think about the weakness of natural selection, it pretty much perfectly emulates the kind of data I've shown you, in that when animals and plants that age are studied throughout their lives, first you get the period of low mortality, then you get the period of rising mortality, and then the weakness of natural selection stabilizes. So this is the core theory for how evolutionary biologists explain now both the phenomenon of aging and actually its later cessation, or as I like to say, the period of biological immortality. Now, this was a theory that Larry Muller, my colleague at UC Irvine, and I published in the mid-1990s. Now, being an experimentalist, I immediately set about collecting data to test whether or not this basic idea was true. And I returned to the B&O flies I've explained to you before, because they have different ages, not only of when reproduction starts, but also of when reproduction stops. And the simple way to understand the mathematical theory that has been developed is aging should start when reproduction starts in a population, but also aging should stop sometime around the age at which reproduction stops in an evolving population, if it has maintained that regime for many dozens of generations. So what that meant is that these flies also provided a natural way to test whether or not the theory I just described to you is correct. Because this theory implies that not only can the beginning and rate of aging evolve very easily in a lab, but also the age at which aging stops should evolve very easily in a lab. So we looked at these same populations. Could I have the next slide, please? So these are the B&O populations with their different last stages of reproduction, as well as first stages of reproduction, which implies both different patterns of aging and different patterns for the cessation of aging. Next slide, please. Here are their survival patterns, where the asterisks in these data, males on the left, females on the right, show the ages at which we statistically estimate aging has stopped. And it's pretty easy to see over there, for example, in the B data, the red lines there, this is 5 different cohorts from 5 different populations. You see the rapid increase in death rates on a log scale, and then it stops increasing. Those are in the populations reproduced at early ages. In those populations, aging basically comes to an end at around 20 days of adulthood. The O populations, which will reproduce later, have this slow process of aging, a gentle process of aging, and then hit biological immortality post-aging much later. And you'll notice that all through the blue data, which are from the O populations, you have lower mortality rates. Put in biological terms, that means they are healthier across all these ages. As far as we care to measure, they are very robust, only dying many times later than the bee flies from which they originally evolved. So if I could have my last slide, please. Here are my conclusions, which I would offer to Neil and his congregation and everyone else listening as words of hope, words that are very positive. My first point is plenty of organisms, what biologists used as a term to include plants and animals. Could I go back to my concluding slide, please? I got skipped away from it. We go back. I lost my last slide. Thank you very much. Plenty of organisms have biological immortality. They don't ever age at any time because natural selection can solve whatever problems an organism faces that might otherwise cause it to age. However, in organisms that don't reproduce by splitting in two, that are strictly reproducing by eggs or seeds, like all mammals, like all insects, in those organisms, we predict a phase of aging due to the declining force of natural selection with adult age between when reproduction starts in a population and when it ends. But eventually, reproduction ends in any given cohort. And at that point in time, after those ages, biological deterioration, aging, stops because the force of natural selection stops declining. In 5 words, we age toward biological immortality. What that means is at precisely the age when rust never sleeps theories of aging, like Denham-Harmon's or Aristotle's or any of R.B. de Grey's ideas, at exactly the ages when they expect us to rush off to our graves, we don't do it. Because humans, like every other living thing on this planet, does not follow the theories of conventional gerontology. It follows the rules of evolution by natural selection, the most powerful creative force on this planet. Thank you.
That was a very, very remarkable presentation, Dr. Rose.
Thank you, Bill.
I wanted to ask you some questions about that. Neil, is this the right time for me to start asking questions? Okay. You were talking about delayed reproductive maturation as it related to the fruit flies who you said you didn't let lay the eggs or delayed them laying the eggs. Is that correct?
Actually, they reproductively mature just a day or so later. They then have sex week after week after week. They're partying it up just like you do in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't actually produce children until much later because that's when I let them, or my graduate students let them, biologically reproduce.
So you delay the reproduction, but not the ability to reproduce.
or even the recreational activity, just as, we do with graduate students and medical students and medical residents and postdocs. Yeah, they can have all the sex they want, and they do, but the actual production of offspring happens later. So in other words, it is not an effect of avoiding sex as a recreational activity.
Well, I recall a presentation you made at a conference about 8-9 years ago. You talked about the salmon who would swim upstream to reproduce, the male salmon, and then they would die right after they reproduced, whereas the salmon who just swam in the Pacific Ocean for a long time, they lived maybe 6-7 years. And what it was is they were essentially, I guess, delaying having sex, but it was not related to delayed reproductive maturity, is what you're saying. It's just that their very act of engaging in sex upstream is what caused them to acutely die.
So there's a lot to be said about that, Bill, and that's a really good question. So the simultaneity of sex and death in that species occurs because evolution by natural selection has tuned their life cycle so that when they are swimming upstream, natural selection directs them first to put all their resources into successfully swimming upstream. It's very challenging. And then with whatever they have left, it all goes into producing gametes, shedding those gametes in the water of their streams along with dozens and dozens of other salmon. And once they've done that, their probability of being able to go back out to sea and back again is effectively zero. So their bodies undergo one of the most rapid processes of animal aging we know of in the living world. Interesting contrast is with Atlantic salmon, which are now extinct in the wild, in which they don't have the ascent geographically from the ocean to their natal streams. They didn't. And of Pacific salmon. So it was fairly easy for them to go to the natal stream, squirt out their gametes, go back out to the ocean and back and forth. And the Atlantic salmon exhibits no such pattern.
Very interesting.
The Atlantic salmon can reproduce over and over again. There are actually many insects that are analogous to the Pacific salmon, the most famous of which are the mayflies that emerge as adults without any mouth parts. They'll never feed as adults. All they'll do is fly around looking for that, significant other with whom they, have a brief copulation. And after they've done that over the course of a day or 2 days, they're all dead. Okay? So natural selection at one end of the spectrum can produce a very extreme aging process that does in fact kill virtually every individual in the population once they've entered the reproductive window. But the vast majority of species are like humans in that we have multiple opportunities to reproduce. So, while Jimi Hendrix approximated the Pacific salmon and had a spectacular 3 to 4 years of frequent copulation, interspersed with rock concerts, and died thanks to his lifestyle. Most humans do not live that way. Most humans, don't have hundreds of mating opportunities over the course of a few years or thousands. And instead, we stretch it out. It all gets stretched out. And in fact, it stretches out to such an extent that some of us will live long enough to enter the post-aging phase.
Very interesting. One of our researchers has sent me a tremendous amount of material that he's written up on the potential virtues of humans delaying reproductive maturity using drugs like Lupron, which suppresses the release of luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland, and that essentially delays puberty. And his argument, and it echoes a lot of what you're saying, is that if young people chose to delay reproductive maturity, literally delay their their onset of puberty, that they theoretically would live a lot longer, including, of course, the delay in the involution of the thymus gland. So he gives a lot of references to this. Is this something that you considered or pondered, at least, as it relates to what young people could theoretically do if they chose to?
Well, remember, that would be a decision made by young people between the ages of 10 and 13.
Correct.
So there, I don't think almost no modern day physicians would cooperate with the child of 10 who wanted to take drugs like that. However, there was an experiment done by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages where they castrated many prepubescent boys to preserve their voices in Catholic choirs. Okay? The castrati. And their biology is pretty amazing. Among other things, they actually tended to be taller than the people around them. Of course, their biology was different in quite a few respects. There are some historical claims that they lived long and healthy lives. Somewhat more tragically, I know of one other body of data that bears on the question of castration in humans and lifespan. And that was an experiment conducted chiefly in the American South, where under the influence of eugenics laws, they castrated felons and put them in indefinite incarceration. And most of the felons that were castrated in the Old South happened to be African Americans. And if you compare the survival patterns of these forcibly castrated individuals, the males tended to live about 10 years longer than similar individuals who were not castrated. And I have often brought up this point in my lectures over the last 40 years. And one of the almost universal reaction in the males of the audience is, "Oh God, no." And a frequent joke that is made in response to this little story is, "Well, however long you live after castration, it will certainly feel longer." You'd be surprised how often I've heard that exact joke. However, after I made that comment once to a senior citizens later life educational group, a very old man in his 90s came up to me and told me that he had been castrated because of testicular cancer, and that ever since then his health had been quite good. And he felt happy about his castration because he attributed his great longevity and health due to that surgical intervention. So, Bill, I put it to you, whatever the conjectural effects of delaying puberty, you, as a biologically intact male, have a choice you can make right now.
I'm going to put the kitchen knife away for the moment, but the androgen deprivation syndrome that prostate cancer patients encounter when their testosterone is chemically shut down, or even via castration, often it results in unfavorable factors, a lot of bone deterioration, just a lot of adverse effects. So once you pass puberty and you're an aged person, it seems like suddenly removing the testosterone in men, certainly with women, a lot of deleterious effects begin to occur. So there's a lot of...
But Bill, when you average out all of the positive and deleterious effects together, the average longevity appears to be very substantially enhanced, on the order of a decade. It's the single most powerful biological intervention to increase lifespan that we have good data on. Now, castration is not the same thing as taking a drug that will lower your testosterone level. That's a fundamentally different biological intervention because of all of the secondary effects of those kinds of drugs, because all drugs have hundreds of effects all through the transcriptome and metabolome. All drugs.
Understood. No, makes sense, but that is fascinating information that you're disseminating. It leads a lot of scientists then to pursue avenues of research that could literally result in some major advances. You may be aware of what we've been recommending for the last 4 to 5 years for our followers to consider: a drug called Metformin, boosts AMPK, suppresses mTOR a bit, and we feel most people should be on that. If you have an opinion on it, feel free to let the group know, because most of us are taking it right now.
Okay. So I'm very interested in drug research. Full disclosure, I've been a founder and consultant to 2 different baby pharmas, and I still consult for private sector companies. What I haven't shown in this talk is all the work we have been doing on genomics, transcriptomics, and metabolomics. And the fundamental problem that is now facing all pharmaceutical companies and all supplement companies that wish to retune physiology is that even if you are absolutely correct about the directly observed effect on 1 or 2 enzymes of interest, it's now a virtual scientific certainty that you're also affecting hundreds of other enzyme functions, either by altering transcript levels or shifting the balance among metabolome components. That's the value of any particular medication that is taken regularly that does not affect an acute life-threatening condition. You need to look at thousands of transcriptional effects and probably tens of thousands of metabolomic effects, as well as a wide-ranging assay of the functioning of all the organ systems. The idea of truly focal medicational interventions is an idea that died with the advent of genomics about 20 years ago. Basically, we now know enough to know that single or simple pathway models are almost never correct. They're correct less than 5% of the time. Very occasionally, you find a gene product that has extremely focal effects and doesn't connect to dozens to hundreds of other causal pathways physiologically, but that is by far the exception. Overwhelmingly, the rule is that everything is connected to everything else. So even if you get a focal effect that you like, such as a reduced serum glucose level, characteristically, the medications that are prescribed for type 2 diabetes have a host of other effects, many of them adverse, from sarcopenia to cognitive confusion. So I believe that we're on the threshold of systematically evaluating every drug and every supplement that we take from the standpoint of its effects throughout the entire transcriptome, metabolome, and indeed all of the organ systems. And that is a future to which I would like to contribute.
Those are very valid points for virtually every medical or supplemental intervention. Is what are those kind of off-target effects that are deleterious? What we like about metformin is the consistency of the data, the reduced risks of cancer, the reduced risks of progressing from metabolic syndrome to type 2 diabetes, just a myriad of benefits. We've listed them going back to 1995 in our various journals, where it seems like the benefits outweigh the risks. I can't wait, of course, until the trial, which finally got approved and funded, as you may know, got about $70 million of funding, and they're going to test metformin by itself, which we don't really advocate, because by itself it's not going to give us, we feel, the overall consistent benefits we'd like to see with people who also take care of their health systematically. But we may may know in the next 4 to 5 years just how well it really works. And at this point, is there anything that you do recommend for our typical viewer, a typical person? I'm 65 years of age, by the way, and a lot of us are unfortunately older. We're trying to stay alive long enough until your prediction, and we love the prediction you made earlier this year, I think in January, that biological immortality is about 125 years away. Regrettably, we're not going to make it unless we intervene.
Whenever I make a prediction, I err on the side of being conservative.
Thank you.
And I should just disclose to you, Bill, you and I are the same age. So I totally appreciate your predicament. The number one thing I recommend is vitamin D3. And on the one hand, there's a ton of positive data for it, as there for other supplements, but also its toxicity profile is particularly good. It's fairly hard to overdo it, although I believe some people do overdo it. It's well measured in serum samples. And I think it's one of the most common chronic nutritional deficiencies on a modern diet. You have to eat a lot of salmon, among other things, to nutritionally get enough vitamin D3. So, and on the other hand, you have to spend a lot of time outdoors wearing relatively little clothing below specific latitudes. And, you know, you and I are pretty white, Bill. It's, you know, you and I are not spending enough time out of doors. It's just, I can just look at you and tell that. And I'm guilty of that as well. So you and I definitely need to supplement with vitamin D3. After that, I think I don't make universal supplement recommendations. If there are specific problems that people have, like an overly high serum glucose level, muscle spasms, and other specific symptoms that specific drugs and supplements can address, then by all means. But vitamin D3 is my one universal go-to.
Understood. We've been talking about that for a couple decades. And what's really nice about D3 as opposed to so many other supplements is we can measure the levels rather precisely in the blood. We currently recommend about 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter, probably being that ideal range. And we do find people sometimes exceeding 100. And what we do is we call them up. We say, stop taking your supplement for a while. It'll stay up there for a while. And then, get another test a couple months later and get it between that 40 and 60 nanogram per milliliter range. And that's probably the optimal place to be from what we know today. So appreciate that insight. And is there anything that you're personally doing that you'd like to relate to our group that we might want to emulate based on your incredible knowledge?
Well, for people over 40, I universally recommend that they transition to a scientifically correct paleo diet. And this is something where we've done a lot of research over the last decade. Some of it's published, some of it isn't. It turns out to be a very general principle that if you're a species that has undergone a major lifestyle change in its recent evolutionary history, I don't mean in the last 2 generations, I mean the last, 100 to 500 generations, then young people are well adapted to that new lifestyle because that's enough time for natural selection to take care of them. But the older you are, the less attention natural selection pays to adapting you to your new lifestyle. And the vast majority of humanity now leads an agricultural to industrial lifestyle as opposed to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. We lived as hunter-gatherers for at least 1 million years. 1 million years is enough time for natural selection to reach deep, deep into the life cycle to tune your physiology to that particular diet and that particular pattern of activity. 10 to 20,000 years since the agricultural revolution was certainly enough time for Eurasians to adapt to the consumption, particularly of grass species like rice, oats, barley, wheat, and so on. But that adaptation is going to fade out starting in your 30s. And I think it's fairly negligible by the time people hit 50. And I have talks that you can see on YouTube on this. I say that not my views are not based on verbal concepts. They're based on mathematical reasoning and data, because it's a completely general pattern that arises from the decline in the force of natural selection, that young individuals in any population are adapting really fast to the environment as it changes. And the older you are as an individual in a population, the more you're lagging behind the young people in how well you're adapted to the new environment. And there's a simple way I have of trying to convey this idea, which is that none of us are adapted to a diet of Twinkies and Red Bull, right? The Red Bull, the beverage. It's a completely evolutionarily novel diet. It's those kinds of foods, which are very common in supermarkets and convenience stores, are, the highway to obesity and type 2 diabetes, right? Because evolution by natural selection has not adapted us to that diet. Now, if we were to stay on that diet for the next 300,000 years, we'd be perfectly well adapted to it. It's a diet that contains lots of nutrients. Mm-hmm. Just nutrients that we're not particularly good at eating year after year. They're nutrients that won't kill you if you are desperate one afternoon, but if they're a regular part of your diet, you have no adaptation to it. So we're not adapted to industrial foods invented in the last 140 years. Another example of those foods, which is not commonly known, is seed oils. People did not consume seed oils dietarily before 1880. It was an invention of American agribusiness, which slowly spread around the world from the 1890s to the 1950s, bringing with it an upsurge in heart disease and cancer. Similarly, high fructose corn syrup, invented in the 1970s, spread around the world over the last 40 years. Another common food ingredient that fosters obesity and diabetes. And indeed, as it is spread around the world, you get obesity and diabetes.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about that, different presentations. Final question, by the way, is intermittent fasting. A lot of our group is doing it, about 16 hours to 18 hours most days. Some people do it 1 or 2 days a week. Any comments about that as far as your research and knowledge base is concerned?
So we have worked on dietary interventions for more than 30 years. It's quite a lot, I could say, dozens of publications. There's also a lot of interesting human data on this, of course, and you're quite expert in it. But I would say, again, in terms of our evolutionary history, hunter-gatherers don't eat 18 hours a day. They just don't do it. A hunter-gatherer lifestyle involves periods of significant fasting, of significant reduction in nutritional intake, the relentless consumption of calories by modern American individuals of even moderate levels of affluence is an evolutionarily abnormal situation. It's even evolutionarily abnormal by the standards of agricultural lifestyles. Agriculturalists do not get abundant nutrition every day of the year. So I think calling it intermittent fasting or caloric restriction is a misnomer. I think the correct way to think of it is as a reversion to more normal dietary patterns. Okay?
That's
so
fantastic.
I'll just tell you, for myself, I mean, I've practiced intermittent fasting for my entire adult life simply because I've generally been unwilling to take the time to spend that much of my life eating.
Very good.
And one of the benefits of that is I've had no problem with weight control or waist circumference, throughout my life. So I guess to me, eating all the time, 7 days a week, is a completely abnormal and artificial lifestyle. And the more you can avoid that, the better off you will be, short of actual acute starvation.
That is a spectacular conclusion, Dr. Rose. And I just hope your inspirational words and your incredible experience, your lifetime calorie reduction, normalizing diet, in other words, fantastic. Hopefully it will inspire more of our supporters to emulate that.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you both. So I have a couple of questions from some of the people who are watching online, and they're questions both for you and Bill, as well as for Dr. Rose. Bill, I have a question for you first. What dosage of vitamin D3 would you recommend for people to take?
Typical person takes around 5,000 IUs a day. They'll do that for 2 or 3 months, then get a blood test and see where they wind up. The variation is huge. Some people don't absorb as much as they should. They should take it with a fatty meal, by the way. But you never really know what you need. Some people, 2 or 3,000 IUs is all they need. Obese people often need much more than 5,000. I tell people, don't get a blood test initially if you've never supplemented, because I can guarantee you're insufficient or deficient. Take your vitamin D for a month, 3 months, and then get that blood test to see where you wind up. If you're too high, reduce your dose. If you're too low, then increase your dose. Very simple.
Thank you, Bill. Another question, I'll stay with you, Bill, for a moment. A person in Australia is asking, how can they get metformin? How would you recommend they proceed?
To attain metformin, go to a doctor, get a prescription, go on the internet, find pharmacies around the world that ship it. It's readily available. It costs very little. I don't know what the rules in Australia are. Most countries allow personal use importation. And go to Google, and I think you'll find very low-cost sources of it.
Thank you, Bill. Dr. Rose, I have a question for you. And let me find that. So, Dr. Rose, when you say natural selection stops, do you mean that the genes that would have led to the death of an organism should have already arisen by that advanced stage and are no longer in play?
Well, actually, that's a deep question because it gets at the relationship between our genomes and our physiologies through life. And there's this very important genetic concept called pleiotropy. And what it means is that genetic variation in our genome has very complicated effects on our physiologies at multiple ages and in multiple respects. So characteristically and almost universally, simple statements about what a specific gene is doing are incorrect. Basically, biology, as it now exists, is tremendously complicated. And the only way to really understand it, regrettably, is with a lot of math and indeed, in this day and age, AI.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rose. I think that concludes our questions from our audience. I'd like you to know that we had around 50 people around the world watching, Australia, Germany, and many other places. So Dr. Rose, I applaud you. I want to thank you for spending your time with us today. Bill, thank you as well.
Well, let's mention we've got this recorded. We're going to be sending this out to at least 5,000 people on our age reversal network. You'll send it out to the group that you represent, Neil. So I would expect this is going to be viewed by several thousand people. Typically, our open rate is over 50% when we send out videos.
Yes, that's right. And anyone who's watching online or is watching the recording, I encourage you to reach out to me by email. Go to the website at the Church of Perpetual Life. You can reach me by email there. And if you have any questions, we'll be very happy to attempt to get those answered for you, and hope to see you at our next event. Thank you very much, gentlemen.